Welcome to my channel. In today's video, I'm taking you on a dark and thrilling journey through a spine-chilling horror story. Buckle up as we dive into the eerie tale of the Highway Hauler, where a seasoned trucker encounters the unimaginable on a desolate stretch of road. If you're ready for suspense, terror, and a few sleepless nights, stay tuned. John "Big Jack" Wallace had been a trucker for over 20 years. He'd seen every stretch of highway this country had to offer, from the snowy passes of Colorado to the scorching deserts of Arizona. But nothing prepared him for the journey that lay ahead on this particular night. It was a moonless night, the kind where the darkness felt thick and suffocating. The highway was unusually deserted for a Friday night, and the only sound was the low hum of his 18-wheeler's engine. Big Jack had picked up a load in Bakersfield, California, and was en route to Salt Lake City. The route was familiar, but something felt off. The dispatcher's instructions had been vague, and the load itself was a sealed trailer, the contents of which he was not allowed to know. His mind drifted back to the conversation with his dispatcher, a wiry man named Pete who had a nervous twitch. "Jack, this one's important. Just get the cargo there, no questions asked," Pete had said, avoiding eye contact. "And avoid stopping unless absolutely necessary." Big Jack was a veteran trucker. He knew when something was amiss, but the pay was too good to turn down. Plus, he'd faced his share of odd jobs in the past. This, he figured, was just another strange gig. As the miles rolled by, the road seemed to stretch endlessly into the void. There were no other vehicles, no rest stops, and no lights save for his own headlights slicing through the darkness. The road signs became increasingly difficult to read, the letters distorted and almost unreadable, as if they were written in a language long forgotten. Then, the first strange occurrence happened. He spotted something on the side of the road, a figure, standing still. As he got closer, Jack realized it was a woman in a tattered white dress, her face obscured by long, tangled hair. He slowed down, unsure of whether to stop. Just as he was about to pull over, she lifted her head, revealing hollow, black eyes and a gaping mouth that seemed to scream silently. In a panic, Jack slammed on the gas, the truck lurching forward as the figure disappeared in his rear-view mirror. His heart pounded in his chest, sweat beading on his forehead. "What the hell was that?" he muttered to himself, glancing at the mirror again, but there was nothing behind him now, just the empty road. He shook his head, trying to shake off the image. It must have been a trick of the light, or maybe he was more tired than he realized. But deep down, he knew that wasn't true. Hours passed, and the feeling of unease grew stronger. The radio, which had been playing classic rock, suddenly cut out, replaced by a low, static-filled whisper. Jack reached over to fiddle with the dial, but the whispering only grew louder, more insistent. He couldn't make out the words, but it sounded like dozens of voices, all speaking at once. Then, without warning, the whispering stopped, and the truck's cab was plunged into an eerie silence. Jack let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. He glanced at the passenger seat out of habit, and his blood ran cold. Sitting there, as if she had been there all along, was the woman in white. Her head slowly turned toward him, and once again, he saw those empty, black eyes and the gaping mouth. This time, however, there was no mistaking the intent in those eyes. She wanted something from him. Jack swerved the truck violently, trying to shake off the apparition, but when he looked back at the seat, she was gone. His knuckles were white as he gripped the steering wheel. This was no hallucination. Something was seriously wrong. Jack needed to stop and gather his thoughts, but as he scanned the road for any sign of civilization, he found nothing. The landscape had changed subtly. Where there should have been rolling hills and scattered trees, there was now an endless stretch of dead, barren land. The highway itself seemed to have no end, a black ribbon cutting through a lifeless wasteland. Finally, he saw a sign, a small, rusted one barely visible in the darkness. It read, "Dead Man's Rest, 1 mile." The name sent a shiver down his spine, but he needed to stop. The truck's fuel gauge was dipping lower than it should have been, and his nerves were frayed. As he pulled into Dead Man's Rest, he saw that it was nothing more than an old, decrepit gas station and a motel that looked like it hadn't seen guests in decades. The neon sign flickered, casting an eerie green glow over the lot. Jack parked the truck and stepped out, the cool night air hitting his face. The place was silent, too silent. He looked around, expecting to see an attendant, but the station was deserted. "Hello," he called out, but there was no answer. He walked up to the gas pump and was about to start filling the tank when he noticed something odd. There were no prices listed, and the pump handle was ice cold, colder than it should have been in the summer night air. He glanced back at the truck and froze. The woman in white was standing beside the trailer, her hand pressed against the metal as if she could see inside. Jack's heart pounded as he took a step back. The truck's engine roared to life on its own, headlights blazing as if daring him to approach. Suddenly, the door to the gas station slammed open, and an old man with a wild look in his eyes stumbled out. "You need to leave now," the man shouted, his voice hoarse with fear. "It's not safe here. It's never safe." Before Jack could respond, the man darted back inside, slamming the door behind him. Jack didn't need to be told twice. He jumped back into the truck, leaving the fuel pump behind, and floored the gas pedal. The truck roared down the highway, the old station disappearing into the distance. Jack's mind raced as he sped down the highway. Something was wrong with this job, more wrong than he could have ever imagined. The strange occurrences, the apparition, the old man's warning, it all pointed to one thing: the cargo. Whatever was in that trailer was the cause of all this. Jack knew he had to find out what he was hauling, but the trailer was sealed tight, and breaking the seal would mean breaking his contract. But did that even matter anymore? He made up his mind. He needed to know. He needed to see what he was transporting. Jack pulled over on the side of the road, far from the ghostly encounters he'd been having. The darkness felt heavy around him as he grabbed a flashlight and headed to the back of the truck. The seal was thick and strong, but Jack had a bolt cutter in his toolkit. His hands shook as he snapped the seal and swung open the heavy doors. The flashlight beam cut through the darkness of the trailer, revealing stacks of wooden crates, each one marked with strange symbols that Jack couldn't decipher. The air inside was thick and musty, carrying a faint metallic scent. Jack climbed inside, his footsteps echoing in the hollow space. He pried open the nearest crate, his heart hammering in his chest. Inside was something he couldn't have prepared for: a human skull, bleached white and sitting atop a pile of bones, all carefully arranged as if on display. He staggered back, dropping the lid of the crate with a loud bang. These weren't just bones, they were ancient, covered in what looked like ritualistic carvings. This was no ordinary cargo. This was something far darker, far older than he could comprehend. As he stepped back, the flashlight flickered, casting long shadows on the walls of the trailer. The shadows began to move, twisting and contorting, taking the shape of figures with the same hollow eyes as the woman in white. Jack scrambled out of the trailer, his mind reeling. This wasn't just a job. He was transporting something evil, something that was waking up. He slammed the trailer doors shut and raced back to the cab, but as he started the engine, he realized that the road ahead was no longer the highway he had been driving on. The road had changed, morphing into a narrow, winding path flanked by thick, towering trees that seemed to close in on him as he drove. The air grew thick with fog, and the truck's headlights barely pierced the dense mist. Jack tried to turn around, but the road behind him had vanished, swallowed by the encroaching darkness. There was no going back. He gripped the wheel tightly, his knuckles white. The whispers had returned, louder this time, echoing inside the cab. They were all around him now, filling the truck with their unintelligible murmurings. He glanced at the passenger seat, half expecting to see the woman in white again, but it was empty. Yet, the feeling of being watched was stronger than ever. The road seemed to stretch on forever, twisting and turning in impossible ways. Jack's sense of time slipped away. He could no longer tell if he had been driving for hours or mere minutes. The trees pressed closer, their branches scratching against the truck like bony fingers trying to claw their way in. Then, up ahead, Jack saw it, a figure standing in the middle of the road. It was the woman in white again, but this time she wasn't alone. Dozens of figures stood with her, all with the same hollow eyes and twisted, screaming mouths. Jack's foot slammed on the brakes, but the truck didn't stop. It plowed through the figures as if they were made of smoke, their forms dissipating into the fog. But even as they vanished, the whispers grew louder, more frantic, until they were a deafening roar inside his head. Turn back, the voices screamed in unison, but Jack couldn't turn back. There was no road behind him, no escape. The truck was no longer under his control. It sped forward on its own, the steering wheel jerking left and right as if guided by unseen hands. Jack felt the air in the cab grow colder, his breath misting in front of him. The fog outside thickened, swirling around the truck in a vortex of gray and white. And then, without warning, the road came to an end. The truck careened to a stop at the edge of a cliff. Below, the churning waters of a black sea crashed against jagged rocks. The sky above was an endless void, devoid of stars or moon. Jack was trapped. There was no way forward, no way back. The truck's engine died, and the whispers fell silent, leaving an oppressive stillness in their wake. He sat there, breathing heavily, trying to make sense of what was happening. But there was no sense to be made. The road had led him to this place, a place that shouldn't exist. And then he felt it. A presence in the cab with him, colder than the air itself. He turned slowly, his heart pounding in his chest. Sitting in the passenger seat was the woman in white, but this time she wasn't alone. The back of the cab was filled with the shadowy figures, their hollow eyes locked onto him. Jack tried to move, but he was frozen in place. The woman reached out, her cold hand resting on his arm. "Deliver us," she whispered, her voice echoing in his mind. "Free us." The figures leaned closer, their mouths opening wider, revealing darkness that stretched into infinity. Jack felt his vision blur, the world around him fading into black. And then, everything went silent. When Jack awoke, he was no longer in his truck. He was standing on the edge of the cliff, the wind whipping around him. The truck was gone, the road gone, and the figures were nowhere to be seen. But the trailer, the cursed cargo, remained. It was perched precariously on the edge of the cliff, the doors swinging open in the wind. The ancient bones inside seemed to glow with an otherworldly light. Jack knew what he had to do. The cargo had to be destroyed, whatever it was. It was the only way to end this nightmare. With a surge of adrenaline, Jack pushed the trailer. It teetered for a moment, then plunged over the edge, crashing into the Black Sea below. As the trailer sank beneath the waves, Jack felt the weight lift from his shoulders. The whispers were gone, the cold presence vanished. The cursed cargo had been delivered to the depths where it belonged. He turned away from the cliff, and as he did, the road reappeared before him, winding back into the fog. But this time, it felt different. The fog was lifting, the air warming. The sun began to rise on the horizon, casting the road in a golden light. Jack walked back to where his truck should have been, and there it was, waiting for him as if nothing had happened. He climbed into the cab, started the engine, and drove away from that place, never looking back. The highway was normal again, the landscape familiar. Jack drove in silence, the memories of the night fading like a bad dream. But as he reached the outskirts of Salt Lake City, he glanced at the rearview mirror, and for just a moment, he thought he saw her, sitting in the passenger seat, watching him with those hollow eyes. He blinked, and she was gone. Jack kept driving, but the feeling of unease never truly left him. The road ahead was long, and though the cargo was gone, the memory of what he had transported lingered. He was a trucker, after all, and there were always more roads to travel, more miles to cover. But some roads, he knew, should never be taken.